NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal, a titan beyond the court, a legacy beyond the game. But when Ryan Caldwell, a smug, self-important journalist, publicly mocked Shaq's post-NBA career, he had no idea he had just made a colossal mistake. Shaq didn't dodge. He didn't back down. Instead, he delivered a verbal knockout punch, a razor-sharp counterattack so devastating that it silenced the entire press conference and sent social media into a frenzy. This wasn't just a debate. It was a battle for honor. Where are you watching from? Drop your comments below and don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned for the most electrifying content. Now, let's witness the moment Shaq utterly destroys his challenger. The atmosphere inside the press conference room at the New York Marriott Marquis Hotel was as thick as an approaching storm. There was an invisible energy in the air, not loud but taut, stretched like a wire about to snap. Everyone in attendance could feel it, an impending moment that could shake the entire sports media world. At the center of the stage, Shaquille O'Neal sat upright, one hand resting on the table, the other absent-mindedly spinning his massive championship ring on his ring finger. Camera flashes fired relentlessly, reflecting off his deep brown skin, making the ring glisten, a stark reminder of the legendary legacy he left behind in the NBA. Shaq had sat through hundreds of press conferences, but today, something was different. Lined along the long table, his colleagues, producers, and brand representatives sat with polite but somewhat tense smiles. They felt it too, the anticipation humming in the air, like a fuse waiting to be lit. Then, Shaq's gaze landed on one man. He sat in the corner of the room, unlike the other reporters, who were busy typing away, taking notes, checking their cameras. He sat still, calm, confident. The man wore a charcoal gray suit, his neatly combed brown hair slicked back. He held a small microphone in his hand, but the most striking thing about him wasn't his appearance. It was his eyes, sharp as a blade. His lips curled, not in a friendly smile, but in the smirk of a predator, one who had locked onto its prey and was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. He wasn't taking notes. He wasn't on his laptop. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was watching. Waiting. His name was Ryan Caldwell, and Shaq knew exactly who he was. Ryan Caldwell wasn't just a sports journalist. He was a professional instigator. He wrote for the Sports Tribune, but his career thrived on tearing down NBA legends. He had a special hatred for retired players who, as he often put it, hogged the spotlight long after their prime. And Shaquille O'Neal, he was Ryan's #1 target. For a brief moment, Shaq studied him, not with anger, not with caution, but with the sharp focus of a fighter analyzing his opponent before a match. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Ryan Caldwell wasn't here to interview him, he was here to provoke him, and Shaq was ready. Ryan Caldwell wasn't in a hurry. He sat there, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Shaq, like a predator patiently waiting for its prey to slip up. Shaq didn't need to look directly at him to know that Ryan was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had dealt with guys like this before, people who weren't there to learn, to discuss basketball, but to set traps, to provoke, to create a moment of controversy. Just wait, Shaq thought, flicking his eyes toward Ryan for a split second before refocusing on the press conference. In the front row, a blonde reporter, Jessica Moore from Sports Illustrated, raised her hand. "Shaq, what inspires you to be part of Inside the NBA?" Shaq smiled, that familiar, effortless smile of a man who had spent years in front of crowds, someone who knew how to own the stage. "I love basketball, and I want people to love it as much as I do. But more importantly, I want to help young players understand the game better." His answer was calm, sincere. The room nodded in approval. The press conference seemed to be moving along as usual. But then, Ryan tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing every word Shaq had just said. He tapped his fingers lightly against the microphone, not raising his hand to speak, but making sure everyone in the room registered his presence. He wasn't in a rush, because he didn't need to be. Guys like Ryan didn't fire the first shot recklessly. They waited. They let their target get comfortable, let them believe they were in control. And then they struck. Shaq could feel it coming. Even as Jessica moved on to another question about game analysis on television, Shaq could still sense Ryan's stare piercing into him. Like he was studying every micro-expression, searching for a hint of exhaustion, a flicker of impatience, or just the slightest distraction, to exploit it. And then, while Shaq was in the middle of answering the next question, something subtle but crucial happened. Ryan shifted. He no longer sat straight in his chair. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. He created movement. And movement, no matter how small, could trick the human brain into anticipating that something was about to happen. Shaq recognized it as the first sign of an impending attack. He didn't let it show, but inside he was ready. The real game was about to begin. A thin silence, sharp as a blade, sliced through the room. Shaq knew this was coming. He had seen it from the moment Ryan Caldwell stepped in, but when it actually happened, there was still that fleeting moment, a feeling like lightning striking the ground right at his feet. "That's a good answer, Shaq." Ryan's voice wasn't fast, wasn't slow, but there was something buried beneath it. Not respect, but a warning. Everyone in the room felt the shift in the air. Press conferences like this were usually just a sequence of predictable questions, polite exchanges, rehearsed answers. But this was different. Ryan Caldwell wasn't here for an inspiring speech. He stood up, slowly adjusting the microphone on his collar, as if crafting a moment for himself. A small stage in the packed press room. The room immediately fell silent. Some reporters pulled their hands away from their keyboards, eyes locked on Shaq and Ryan, as if they had just realized they were witnessing the headline of tomorrow's news. "But I have a real question for you." Shaq held Ryan's gaze unblinking. Here it was, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment Shaq knew was inevitable. Ryan narrowed his eyes, tilting his head slightly, like a man who knew he was in control. "You had an incredible playing career. No one denies that." He paused, a silence just long enough for the room to hold its breath. "But let's be honest. Do you really think you're cut out to be an analyst?" Click. A reporter instinctively pressed the record button on their device. Ryan wasn't done. "A lot of people say you lack tactical knowledge, Shaq, that you played the game relying on your size and dominance, but when it comes to breaking the game down, you don't have the depth of Charles Barkley or Kenny Smith." That line hit the center of the room like a backboard-shattering dunk. Some reporters inhaled sharply. Others leaned forward, making sure they wouldn't miss a single flicker of expression on Shaq's face. The energy in the room shifted in an instant. This was no longer just a press conference. This was a confrontation. Ryan hadn't just asked a question. He had thrown a punch. A calculated, deliberate strike. There was no short answer. No sidestepping. No laughing it off and moving on like it was just another question. Ryan had placed Shaq in front of a question where any response could be twisted, edited, and spread across social media. If Shaq got angry, the headline would read, "Shaquille O'Neal loses his temper over analyst criticism." If Shaq dodged, the headline would be, "Shaquille O'Neal refuses to answer questions about his basketball IQ." A perfect trap. Ryan's lips curled into a barely perceptible smirk. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew Shaq couldn't just ignore this. And now, all he had to do was wait. Those words weren't a question. They were a declaration of war. Shaq felt it instantly. He didn't blink. His expression didn't change. His face remained calm, solid, like a slab of stone. But inside, a storm was brewing. Ryan Caldwell knew he had just thrown a match into a pile of dry hay. What he didn't know was that Shaq was used to fire. Shaq didn't rush to respond. Instead, he slowly reached for his water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and took a long sip. Silence stretched. A few seconds. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. No one spoke, and in those agonizingly long seconds, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. Ryan frowned. He hadn't expected Shaq to draw out the moment like this. He was used to throwing sharp questions and watching his opponent scramble, either with hesitation or with anger. But this time, there was no hesitation, no anger, just deadly silence. Ryan could feel the entire room staring at him, and then Shaq placed the bottle back down. He lifted his gaze and looked straight at Ryan. His voice was low, slow, but heavy with weight. "Have you ever played in the NBA?" The question hit the air like a backboard-shattering dunk. Ryan froze for a second. He blinked once. A simple response, but as sharp as a blade slicing through any elaborate argument. No defense, no justification, just cold, undeniable truth. And everyone in the room understood it. The heavy silence of the room was shattered by Shaq's sharp-edged question. "Have you ever played in the NBA?" Ryan Caldwell hesitated for a fraction of a second. He didn't visibly falter, but in his eyes there was the briefest flicker of doubt, just a split second. But Shaq caught it. The whole room caught it. And before Ryan could recover, Shaq delivered the next blow. "Have you ever played against Michael Jordan? Kobe Bryant? Tim Duncan?" Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze darkening as if he were seeing right through Ryan. "Or did you learn basketball strategy from YouTube?" The room erupted. Some reporters couldn't help but burst into laughter. Not because Shaq's words were a joke, but because they all knew. Ryan had just been backed into a corner. Ryan let out a dry chuckle, the kind meant to mask unease. But to those who were paying attention, it was clear. He was trying to hide his discomfort. He tried to regain control, adjusted his collar, and replied, "I don't need to play in the NBA to understand the game, Shaq. I'm a journalist." Mistake. Shaq shook his head, a cold smirk forming. "Then why should I explain strategy to you?" The room exploded with laughter, no longer just whispers or muffled chuckles. This time it was loud. Even the neutral ones in the room couldn't hold back. Some reporters turned to each other, as if they had just witnessed a vicious slam dunk right before their eyes. Ryan tightened his grip on the microphone. He hadn't expected Shaq to strike back with such precision. Hadn't expected to be put on the defensive so quickly. He had planned this moment carefully, had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to publicly take Shaq down. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. Shaquille O'Neal was not someone you could easily corner. And now, Ryan was the one who had to defend himself. Ryan refused to lose. He couldn't afford to lose. Being publicly outwitted like this in front of dozens of reporters with millions more watching the replay online? Number. That was not something he could allow to happen. He tightened his grip on the microphone, took a slow breath, then straightened his back, his gaze sharpening. He had to strike back. He had to make Shaq lose his composure. I think the real issue here isn't whether I play basketball or not, Ryan said, his voice deliberately calm. It's how you treat young players. The room fell silent again. A few reporters exchanged glances, realizing Ryan had shifted his strategy. He was no longer attacking Shaq's expertise. He was going after his reputation, the way people perceived him. Ryan paused just long enough to ensure every eye in the room was on him before continuing. Take Dwight Howard, for example. The reaction was immediate. Some reporters raised their eyebrows. Others quickly jotted down notes, aware that this was not a new story. Shaq's expression remained unchanged, but the silence around him grew heavier. Ryan felt it. He pressed on. You called him a fake Superman. Why would a legend like you need to tear down the next generation? A simple question, yet it carried the spark of a firestorm. Ryan knew exactly how the headlines would play out. Shaq called out for bullying young players. Shaq faces tough questions on fairness in sports commentary. Shaq under fire for attacking Dwight Howard. If Shaq got angry, Ryan would have his perfect story. If Shaq dodged the question, Ryan would walk away the undisputed winner. But Shaq did neither. Instead, his expression changed. Not to anger, not to discomfort, but to something colder, something unshakable. Shaq tilted his head slightly and smirked, not a friendly smirk. Do you know why I called Dwight Howard that? Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because this wasn't a question meant for him. Shaq was taking control of the game. He leaned forward, his powerful arms resting firmly on the table, his gaze locked onto Ryan. His eyes burned, not with fury, but with an unshakable certainty. His voice was slow, deliberate, and every word dropped like a hammer. Because Superman doesn't beg people to call him Superman. The press room erupted. Murmurs, rapid keystrokes, sharp intakes of breath as the reporters realized they had just heard a quote that would be the headline everywhere. Ryan was speechless. He had no counter, because that wasn't just an answer. It was a truth, and a truth could not be denied. The murmurs in the press conference room hadn't died down yet. All eyes were glued to Shaq, eager to see what he would do next. Ryan Caldwell, who had just taken a heavy hit from Shaq's Superman remark, was trying to keep his composure. But he couldn't hide one undeniable truth. He had lost control. His question was no longer a trap. Shaq had crushed it into pieces, and now he was the one backed into a corner. Shaq kept his gaze locked on Ryan. He wasn't smiling anymore. He didn't need to. His voice was deep, deliberate, every word landing like a punch to Ryan's arrogance. And I don't bully anyone. I teach them how to be the best. But the problem is, not everyone can reach that level. Ryan said nothing. The other reporters said nothing, because they knew this was no longer a debate. This was an undeniable truth. Shaq leaned forward, placing his powerful arms on the table, his eyes never leaving Ryan. He wasn't angry. He had already won. But he still had one final blow, one sentence that would end this confrontation for good. "I don't wait for people to call me a legend. I become one." The press room erupted. Applause thundered through the air. Some reporters nodded, smiling, as if they had just witnessed one of the greatest moments in a sports press conference. Others scrambled to write, fingers hammering their keyboards, knowing that this quote would be on every headline. Ryan sat frozen. He could feel the shift in the room. He no longer had control. The game was over, and he was the one who lost. The applause hadn't even died down yet, but the real storm was happening out there, on phone screens, across social media, and in sports forums. Shaquille O'Neal destroys the reporter who dared to provoke him. Shaq versus Ryan Caldwell. Who really understands the NBA? Superman doesn't need anyone's approval. Shaq shuts down a provocative question. Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok were flooded with clips. Everything exploded the moment Shaq's final words still echoed in the press conference room. A quick-thinking reporter clipped the moment Shaq fired back and uploaded it to Twitter. In less than 15 minutes, the video had over 500,000 views. The hashtag #Shaq destroys Ryan started trending. NBA fans went wild in the comments. "Damn, Shaq just annihilated him on live TV." "Who the hell told Ryan he could go toe-to-toe with Shaquille O'Neal? Who?" Superman has spoken, and this time there's no comeback. On TikTok, countless accounts clipped Shaq's response and added dramatic sound effects. "You can't handle the truth," from a few good men, was synced perfectly. With Shaq's words, "I don't wait for others to call me a legend. I become a legend." Boom! Headshot. Blasted right as Shaq said, "So why do I need to explain? Strategy to you." Major sports networks like ESPN, Bleacher Report, and The Athletic began covering the showdown. But this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Ryan Caldwell was in trouble. His personal social media accounts were getting dug up. People unearthed his old posts where he had criticized not just Shaq, but LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and even the legendary Bill Russell. NBA fans started pointing out that Ryan had a habit of attacking great players, especially after they retired. His comment section was flooded with mockery. "Dude talks a big game, but never played a single minute in the league." "Hey Ryan, did you ever play against Michael Jordan?" "No, so you learned. Strategy from YouTube?" Mocking Shaq's response. "How does it feel to get dunked on by Shaq on national television?" Sports meme pages wasted no time. A photo of Shaq sitting back comfortably with the caption, "Have you ever played in the NBA?" A meme of Ryan looking dumbfounded, captioned, "When you realize you're not the smartest person in the room." Ryan Caldwell's image, once that of a sharp sports journalist, was now drowning in ridicule. Shaq, on the other hand, was completely unbothered. He didn't post anything, no comments, no reactions, and that only made his presence even stronger. One fan tweeted, "Shaq doesn't need to say a word. He already said everything that needed to be said in that press conference." A veteran sports journalist added, "Shaquille O'Neal didn't just win this exchange. He just reminded everyone why he's one of the greatest legends of all time." The more silent Shaq was, the more powerful he became. But Ryan Caldwell? He couldn't stay silent forever. this story wasn't over yet. The showdown between Shaquille O'Neal and Ryan Caldwell didn't just explode on social media, it quickly became the hottest topic on sports television. Top sports commentary shows on ESPN, Fox Sports, and TNT dissected every word Shaq said, every glance, every smirk he made in the press conference. This was no longer just a basketball debate. It had become a cultural event. On First Take, Stephen A. Smith, one of the sharpest sports commentators, sat up straight, his eyes blazing as he spoke about the moment. "Let me tell you something right now," he said, pointing at the screen. "Shaquille O'Neal just delivered one of the greatest clapbacks in sports press conference history. Ryan Caldwell thought he could take down Shaq, but guess what? He made a mistake, because Shaq isn't just a legend on the court. He's too smart to fall into a trap set by someone like Ryan." Stephen lowered his voice, locking eyes with the camera. "When you ask an NBA legend, 'Do you even understand basketball?' you just ended your own career." The people in the studio nodded repeatedly, some even chuckling at the brutal truth. "Remember Shaq's words," Stephen A. Smith continued. "I don't wait for people to call me a legend. I became one." Who can argue with that? Who? Meanwhile, on Undisputed, Skip Bayless, known for his tendency to challenge NBA greats, offered a different take. "I'm not denying that Shaq won this battle," Skip began, his tone slightly irritated. "But let's be honest, he was arrogant. Yes, Shaq is a legend. Yes, he has 4 championship rings. But does that give him the right to dismiss anyone who hasn't played in the NBA?" Shannon Sharp, sitting across from Skip, immediately cut in. "Come on, Skip. Are you serious? Ryan Caldwell dug his own grave. He asked a dumb question, and Shaq simply responded." Skip shrugged, unconvinced. "I'm just saying Shaq might have gone too far," Skip argued. "I'm not saying Ryan was right, but Shaq put him down in a way that wasn't necessary. That could hurt his image with some people." Shannon laughed, shaking his head. "Skip, you know who's going to think Shaq took an L? Only people like Ryan Caldwell." Colin Cowherd on the Herd. "Shaq did the right thing. When someone provokes you, you don't shrink back. You stand tall, just like Shaq did." Max Kellerman on This Just In. "I don't think Shaq needed to prove anything, but I love how he did it." Nick Wright on First Things First. "Ryan Caldwell just made himself the biggest loser in sports journalism." While Shaq was being celebrated, Ryan Caldwell was living through the worst moments of his career. His silence only made things worse. Producers from sports talk shows were calling nonstop, inviting him for interviews, but he turned them all down, because he knew there was no way to flip this. Everything he had built, his reputation as a sharp journalist, the fearless challenger of legends, was crumbling before his eyes. And worse, Shaq didn't even have to say another word. Ryan was losing, even after his opponent had left the stage. But would he just sit there and accept defeat? Or would he find a way to strike back? The story isn't over yet. The showdown between Shaquille O'Neal and Ryan Caldwell was no longer just a heated moment in a press conference. It had spread across all fronts: social media, mainstream media, and now even TNT itself, where Shaq was employed. Inside the offices of TNT sports executives, the atmosphere had grown tense. They didn't know how to handle the situation. On one hand, Shaq was becoming a hero to fans who despised the sports media's tendency to provoke and manipulate narratives. On the other hand, Ryan Caldwell had his own allies in the press, journalists, critics, and entire media factions with a vested interest in protecting him. They began speaking up. They twisted the story, portraying Shaq as someone who disrespected the media, someone who couldn't handle tough questions, someone who had humiliated a journalist simply for daring to challenge him. TNT knew what was coming. Pressure from major news outlets was mounting. Sponsors were closely monitoring the public's reaction. Some brands that had contracts with Shaq were waiting to see if the situation would escalate before deciding their next move. The executives' phones rang non-stop. Messages flooded in from corporate partners, PR teams, and brand image consultants. Then, Shaq received a text from the TNT network director. "Shaq, should we issue an apology?" An apology? Shaq stared at the screen. Something boiled inside him. Why should he apologize? Ryan was the one who provoked him. Ryan set a trap. Ryan tried to humiliate him in front of the entire media. And now that the tables had turned, Ryan was playing the victim. Shaq knew exactly how this game worked. The media could twist anything to serve their agenda. He clenched his jaw, his eyes drifting to the window. New York sprawled beneath him, still glowing with city lights, still buzzing with energy as if nothing had happened. But he knew that somewhere, in some newsroom, in some corporate meeting, people like Ryan Caldwell were working to spin the narrative. They were trying to turn him from a hero into a villain. And now, TNT wanted him to back down? Shaq didn't respond right away. He placed his phone on the desk, folded his arms across his chest, and thought. Beside him, his longtime assistant, Mark Lewis, who had been with him since his early days at TNT, watched him with concern. "They really want you to apologize?" Mark asked, disbelief in his voice. Shaq nodded slowly. Mark lowered his voice. "You know they don't care about right or wrong, right? They just want to protect their image. If you don't apologize, they'll worry about sponsors pulling out. But if you do..." Shaq lifted his head, finishing the thought for him. "I admit that I was wrong." Mark nodded. Shaq exhaled, leaning back in his chair. This wasn't the first time he'd been put in a position like this, but this time was different. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment mistake. It wasn't a reckless comment made in anger. This time, he had spoken the truth, and the truth didn't need an apology. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the network director. "We need an answer soon. If not, we'll have to make a decision for you." Shaq stared at the words. They were pushing him. But what they didn't understand was he had never been the type to be pushed. While Shaq was deep in thought, closed-door meetings continued at TNT headquarters. Some executives were worried about maintaining good relationships with the press. Others believed Shaq was too big to be taken down by an unknown journalist. But one thing they all agreed on. This was a double-edged sword. If they sided with Shaq, they risked losing media protection. But if they forced Shaq to apologize, they could lose his loyal audience. They were at a high-stakes crossroads, and they needed Shaq's answer. But Shaq knew one thing. If he backed down now, he would never stand tall in front of them again. He picked up his phone, but instead of replying to the message, he set it aside. He looked at Mark, his gaze unwavering. No. Mark let out a small smile as if he had already known the answer. Well, they won't be happy about that, Shaq. Shaq shrugged, his voice low but firm. They don't have to be happy. They just need to know I'm not changing my stance. Meanwhile, inside TNT's offices, a phone call was being made, and the story was far from over. Shaq stood on the balcony, his hands gripping the cold steel railing, eyes fixed on the dazzling cityscape of New York below. The city that never sleeps. Traffic streaked through the night like glowing veins. Skyscrapers pulsed with neon lights, and the streets, packed with people, buzzed with an energy that never seemed to fade. But for Shaq, everything was changing. In less than 48 hours, a single response at a press conference had escalated into an all-out public battle. The media was trying to force him on the defensive. TNT was wavering, unsure of whether to stand by him or not. Ryan Caldwell, the man who had tried to take him down, was now being shielded by sections of the press as if he were the victim. And now, Shaq had a decision to make. He picked up his phone. The screen lit up with the latest message from TNT's executive. Shaq, think carefully. We don't want to make this more complicated. A missed call from his agent. An email from the PR team. A text from a major brand partner. We hope you can de-escalate the situation. We don't want to have to reevaluate our contract. Shaq took a deep breath. He could feel the weight pressing down on his shoulders. They wanted him to walk it back. They wanted him to smooth things over with Ryan Caldwell, to appease the media, to reassure the people who thought an NBA legend had no right to push back against a loaded question. But Shaq wasn't going to do that. He set the phone down on the table. I'm not apologizing for telling the truth. While Shaq remained silent, the media kept turning up the pressure. They wanted a reaction. They wanted an apology. They wanted Shaq to express regret. But his silence only made the storm grow louder. CNN, ESPN, and Fox Sports all ran analyses on his decision. A headline appeared on the front page of the New York Times. Shaquille O'Neal refuses to apologize, a bold stand or a costly mistake. Some journalists sided with him, calling him brave for standing up against cheap media tactics. Others called him arrogant, stubborn, even unprofessional. Ryan Caldwell finally broke his silence. He appeared in an exclusive interview on a major sports news network. His image flashed across the screen, his expression composed, but his eyes betraying resentment. I don't have an issue with Shaq, he said, his voice carefully measured. I was just asking a fair question. But his reaction, it makes you wonder if maybe he's not ready to accept the truth. The host nodded. Are you saying Shaq has a problem with criticism? Ryan pressed his lips together as if choosing his words carefully. I wouldn't put it that way, but I think it's something a lot of people are wondering. He had flipped the narrative. Now, it wasn't about him provoking Shaq. Now, it was about whether Shaq could handle pressure. And TNT was getting more nervous by the minute. At TNT Sports headquarters, a closed-door meeting was underway. Executives debated how to handle the situation. We can't let Shaq lose control of this narrative, one executive argued. If he stays silent, the media will write the story for him. But if we force him to apologize, we risk alienating our core audience, another countered. So, what's the solution? We need a statement from Shaq, immediately. Shaq remained on the balcony, the cold New York wind cutting across his face. He knew this game. He had watched it play out his entire career. He had seen others be pressured into retracting their words just to appease the crowd. He had also seen people like Ryan Caldwell, people with nothing to lose, who thrived on turning others into casualties of the media machine. Shaq knew that if he backed down now, they would push him again next time. They would keep controlling the narrative instead of letting the truth speak for itself. He stepped back into his living room and picked up his phone. He dialed TNT's executive. The call was answered immediately. "Shaq, have you reconsidered?" The voice was expectant, as if they thought the pressure had finally broken him. But Shaq only said 3 words. "I'm not apologizing." There was silence on the other end. Finally, the executive sighed. "Are you sure about this, Shaq?" Shaq nodded, even though they couldn't see him. "I've never been more sure." He hung up, set the phone down, and for the first time in 48 hours, Shaq felt completely at peace. But he also knew the real storm hadn't even started yet. Shaq stepped into the light, and he was still himself. The call with the TNT executive had ended, but Shaq knew this wasn't the end. He had just chosen the hard road. He refused to apologize. He didn't back down under media pressure, didn't bow to the political games of the press, but this choice came with a price. Less than an hour after the call, TNT held an emergency meeting. A group of executives sat around the conference table, the white ceiling lights casting sharp shadows on their tense faces. "We need to make a decision right now. Shaq refuses to apologize. That means this story will keep spreading. But if we push him to back down, our audience will react badly." TNT couldn't sit on the fence forever. They could cut Shaq's airtime on Inside the NBA, suspend him temporarily to cool things down, or they could stand by him, take the risk, and go against the media. A decision that was never easy, and whichever path they chose, there would be consequences. While TNT was scrambling for a way out, Ryan Caldwell wasn't giving up. He knew that if he stayed silent now, he would be swallowed whole by public opinion. He needed to take back control of the narrative. That night, he appeared on a late-night talk show, one hosted by someone who was always more sympathetic to the media than to athletes. Ryan played his role well. His voice was steady, his face composed with quiet confidence. "I never intended to hurt Shaquille O'Neal. I simply asked a question about his work as an analyst, and I think for an NBA legend like him, facing tough questions is part of the job." He paused for a moment, then continued with a thin smile. "I don't understand why this has turned into such a big controversy. Is it just because I'm not an NBA player that I don't have the right to ask questions about basketball?" The audience in the studio clapped lightly, not enthusiastic, but enough to create an effect. Ryan could feel himself regaining some control of the narrative, but what he didn't know was that Shaq no longer cared about the game being played, because Shaq had made his decision. And once Shaq made a decision, nothing could shake him. Shaq didn't watch Ryan's interview. He didn't scroll through online debates, criticisms, or defenses of his stance. He didn't call the TNT executives to negotiate or make deals. He simply continued living. The next morning, Shaq showed up on Inside the NBA, just as he always did. He walked onto the set dressed in a charcoal gray suit, a black tie, and a relaxed smile. No sign of tension, no apology, no explanation. When the show went live, Charles Barkley, always one to poke fun at Shaq, looked at him with a knowing smirk. "So, you crushed a reporter in a press conference and blew up the internet. How's that feel, Shaq?" Shaq looked straight into the camera, smiled slightly, and said, "I just told the truth." No further explanation, no defense, just the truth. Ryan Caldwell wouldn't disappear overnight. The media wouldn't stop exploiting the story. TNT would continue facing pressure from both sides. But Shaquille O'Neal had done something that very few in the world of sports and media dared to do. He didn't bow his head. He didn't surrender. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, because he knew exactly who he was. Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the light, and he was still himself. The clash between Shaquille O'Neal and Ryan Caldwell wasn't just another viral moment. It was a lesson in conviction, resilience, and the value of truth. Shaq chose not to back down under media pressure. He refused to let the narrative be manipulated, refused to let others decide for him what was right or wrong. But was this a long-term victory? Ryan Caldwell may have lost in the press conference, but the media never lets go of a story that can be exploited. Will Shaq continue to stand strong against future attacks? Or will the pressure from networks, brands, and public scrutiny eventually force him to give in? What do you think? Did Shaq do the right thing by standing his ground, or should he have handled the situation differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more great content. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.